So, if you're like me, you recently started playing Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and the other day I was having a conversation with one of my friends, and they asked me, why does everyone think this game is so amazing? And when he said that, my first reaction was honestly, what? Are you serious? I proceeded to try and explain to him why the verticality of Tears of the Kingdom is incredible, how the physics may be some of the best in the history of gaming, and the fact that it runs on a handheld console like the Switch with a chipset that's like 7 years old or something is honestly a minor miracle. There are actually many people online asking similar questions, like, is it just DLC for Breath of the Wild? It doesn't look any better than Breath of the Wild. It took them 5+ years to put out like a slightly updated version that still runs at 30 frames per second in the best of times. But to me, these statements are just missing the point. So let's take this piece by piece. Starting with the arguments against Tears of the Kingdom, I'll put up a disclaimer now for minor spoilers for the first 10 to 15 hours of the game, but I won't reveal any large story issues or anything like that. First of all, is Tears of the Kingdom just DLC for Breath of the Wild? And the answer is obviously not. But let's take a look at why someone would think that. Well, first of all, the graphics, yes, it's using the same engine, it's the same world, it's the same style, it's the same cell shade. The world is very similar to Breath of the Wild. In fact, it has many of the same areas, same villages. They've all just been changed by time and the events of the story. That being said, if you look at some other major franchises, you could say the same thing. Like, would you say that God of War Ragnarok is just DLC for God of War? Probably not, right? That game is pretty much regarded as a masterpiece. Would you say that Horizon Forbidden West is just DLC for Horizon Zero Dawn? No, you wouldn't, obviously. So, why is that? What is it about Tears of the Kingdom that really separates it and makes it not DLC? Well, first of all, without giving too much away, the map is huge. It's not just Hyrule, there's more to it. Obviously, they showed off the Sky Isles, but there is a lot that's baked into this world. It is not just your normal Hyrule. It's not just those villages and things that you ran through, and it's not the same experience. Secondly, they changed a lot in terms of the powers and abilities that Link gets through the game. Obviously, this starts with the Ultra Hand and with building different equipment and those types of things, but it only takes a quick Google search to see all of the various ways that people are using their creativity with this game to build some outrageous and outlandish things. I mean, everything from fully functional mechs with all kinds of weapons that I won't get into, that literally walk around the earth, to paddle boats, to flying hovercrafts. I mean, you name it, people are attempting to build it in this game. Next, you have the changes to all the powers that you would have gotten in the first game. So you don't have the ability to stop time, but you have the ability to rewind time. And it applies to almost everything. In fact, Ultra Hand and the time rewind ability work together. Now, there are some things with Tears of the Kingdom that return, meaning the breakable weapons, basically shattering in just a few uses. Shrines are back, they're changed slightly, and they really function based off of Link's new abilities, but these things are definitely not like the prior ones. And the main reason why is because Tears of the Kingdom allows you to solve puzzles in almost any way you can think of. For example, and again, these aren't story related, they're just shrines I went to. One of the shrines has sort of like this ball pit with all these, those normal balls that you would use to try and get into a hole in one of the shrines for Breath of the Wild. And it has this kind of spinning wheel. It has these plates that you can connect to it. And the idea is you need to scoop a ball out and get it carried up and then onto this chute that takes it to where it's got to be for the target. Well, I was struggling so bad with this thing that I got to the point where I actually built like a little shovel for it, and I stuck the ball to it because the planks kept falling off or the ball would roll away. I said screw it, and I basically took some balls, stuck it to the planks, stuck it on the wheel, let it spin around, and I ran up to the top as fast as I could, and before it broke off and fell off to the side, I grabbed the thing, shook it free, and threw it in because I was so frustrated with having struggled with it for so long. But it worked. In another one, I was supposed to build a ramp and then shoot a ball off of it, but it kept hitting the corner. I couldn't line it up right, so you know what I did? I ran back through, I grabbed every single platform and piece that I could put together. I built a gigantic bridge. I used my Ultra Hand and I walked the thing across it and dropped it in the hole. Are these the way it's meant to be solved? Probably not, because there are all these mechanisms that I didn't end up using. But that's not the point of the game. The point is, any way you can get it done, that's all that matters, right? The point of playing the game is winning the game.
Hello? You play to win the game. You don't play to just play it.
The point of going into the shrines is completing the task by any means necessary. And I think that's one of the main takeaways from Tears of the Kingdom. Any means necessary means just that. You can basically think of anything as extravagant as possible or as simple, whatever it is. Now, when it came to going into the game, one of the first things that struck me was, when I was watching the trailers and everything, I don't know exactly how all this building and stuff is going to work for me. If you don't know, I'm big into the Souls games. I loved Elden Ring last year. I played through all of those. I started looking for other action RPGs to play through. Combat is big for me. Bosses are big for me. I haven't gotten too deep in the story. I'm not going to go crazy with that. But the combat is generally the same. The combat is not amazing. But because of everything else the world has to offer, because of all of the creativity and openness, and because of how simple they make it to use, it's not a problem. You know, you just spend a little bit of time and it starts to become more and more intuitive. They do have some little guidelines that kind of help you nudge the right way. So like if you position two things next to each other, if it's not a good link, it'll be like a really tiny bit of goo that would show up between them. And if it's a solid positioning, then it's like a larger bit of goo. So you can, you know, it kind of gives you cues that you've lined things up properly to build what you're trying to build. There are many different mechanics that have changed. There are many different areas that have changed. There is so much more to this map. It's so much larger. It's almost overwhelming, to be perfectly honest with you. And they've also addressed another one of the biggest complaints about Breath of the Wild, which was how sparse it was. You could go long periods of time without seeing much more than a couple of enemies or almost nothing in the way of NPCs. Now, honestly, it's almost a problem for me because one of the first things I tried to do was go to each of the sky towers so I could jump off them and map out my area. But I kept seeing things on the way that would distract me. Like, oh, there's a Korok that needs to be rejoined with his, you know, Korok brethren. Or, oh, there's a cave. Or, oh, there's a little goblin encampment. Or, oh, there's a large enemy with base built on top of him and a bunch of goblins. If anything, it's almost too much because then you feel like you're missing out if you just walk by stuff. But at the end of the day, you have to try and get some kind of progress, so you have to make that decision. But it's a nice decision to have. Basically, you have too much to choose from instead of not enough. While Tears of the Kingdom uses the original engine and shares assets, the minimum average time to beat the game and complete the new content is in the neighborhood of 60 to 80 hours, according to the reviewers who got their hands on it early. Most DLCs obviously don't add anywhere near that. They're like in the 6 to 12 hour range, and that's on the high end of stuff. On top of that, this is an entirely new story with a ton of new mechanics and abilities. Not only that, this is a standalone game, so it doesn't require ownership of Breath of the Wild. Much like you wouldn't say that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Torna is a DLC. That doesn't make any sense either, right? They're standalone things. As far as the graphics between the two games, I'll leave it up to professionals like Digital Foundry to break down and explain the differences, but there are incremental improvements to the look of the NPCs, textures, lighting, enemies, and this game is far more demanding on the Switch because of the many new mechanics and abilities. Some of which would likely break many of the current generation games you find on other systems. Some of these games are even being released broken without having abilities like this. But I digress. So to say it took over 5 years to remake the game they already made, we've already talked about why this is a very different game and generally about the scope of the game. For the amount of time, it's important to remember the effect that the pandemic likely had on the timing of the release of the game and the development. The other part of this argument that gamers need to think about is, would we really have felt better about the game if they rushed it out 2 years ago in a terrible state? More like, oh, I don't know, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet? The performance isn't perfect, but it's pretty damn good. And for the majority of the gameplay, it's a rock solid 30 frames per second with great frame pacing. Now, what about that 30 frames per second? Why isn't that a deal breaker? One of the aspects of Breath of the Wild that really wasn't its strength was the combat, and generally speaking, that's where frames per second is most felt. If the frame rate is low or poorly paced, it can result in combat that feels clunky or unresponsive, and it can lead to frustration for the player. Because combat in Tears of the Kingdom really isn't the primary focus, and because frame pacing and latency aren't issues, this really isn't a major issue overall. There are games that run at a solid 30 frames per second or a really inconsistent 60 frames per second or uncapped, and it's important to understand the difference. To provide another example, we just had Redfall drop on the current gen Xbox Series X and on high-end PCs, and it's struggling to hit a consistent 30 frames per second. I mean, it released on one of the two most powerful consoles you can buy right now, and it's got 30 frames per second. This game was released on a handheld. I think people forget about this. This is a handheld device that is, a chipset almost 7 years old in terms of development and everything else. The fact that it can run this giant game with these crazy abilities where you're warping through walls and ceilings and you're putting stuff together and you're building monstrosities and you're crossing this huge world. I mean, you can dive from the skies all the way to the ground and you don't get a loading screen, you don't get a slowdown, you don't get nothing. It's just a clear path, top to bottom. The draw distances are excellent. I mean, look back at games like, again, Pokemon Scarlet Violet, look at Pokemon Legends Arceus and all the weird, funky things that happen in the distance in that game. Look at games that are on Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 that have pop-in all over the place and have shorter draw distances. It's honestly a miracle that this thing runs as well as it does on the Nintendo Switch. Would I like to see it on a higher end piece of hardware? Yeah, sure, and I'm sure when the next generation of Nintendo comes out, we will see that. But as of right now, just the fact that I can have this thing hooked up to my big screen TV, playing through my speakers in my living room, sitting down and having a great time, and if I gotta go somewhere or wait for something, or I just need to step outside for a breath of fresh air, I just pull this thing out, I walk outside, and I continue playing. It's playing on super old hardware that's meant to be portable on a really underpowered unit, even from the time it was released, with very good battery life. I mean, what's not to like about it? So to wrap things up, the game is amazing just as a game. If it was released on any system, I would say, wow. But the fact that it's released on the Nintendo Switch, I mean, you have to consider the medium, right? If you talk about how an artist makes a painting, well, is it oil? Is it acrylic? Did they do it digitally? I mean, that probably doesn't seem as impressive as someone who was like old school oil painting something. You have to consider the medium that it's being used through. So the fact that they could develop this game, create it, run it on the Switch has to be taken into consideration. You could have someone who's playing amazing music on a basic instrument versus someone who's playing mediocre music on a really high-end instrument. Which would you rather have? If someone's creating a game like this on the Nintendo Switch versus a game like Redfall on Xbox Series X or Forspoken on PlayStation 5 or you name it, they all have games that struggle. Or Pokemon Scarlet and Violet on the Nintendo Switch. There's your example right there. They still haven't fixed that game. That thing is still a mess months after release. And then you get a game like this. Rock solid. You don't have your camera clipping through walls. You're not falling through floors. I mean, unless there's a hole down there, but that's a different story. I mean, it's just amazing. Now, is it for everyone? No. And maybe that's another video for another day. But that's just my thoughts. You let me know in the comments if you disagree. So, is it DLC? No. If you do claim it's DLC, you need to start looking at all these other sequels and all these other games where they're looking at the same areas as the original. That's going to do it for my rant for today. Hope you're all enjoying Tears of the Kingdom. Let me know in the comments down below if you are. And this is Pirates for Pirates Gaming saying, until next time, I will see you there.